In the desperate winter of 1941, as German armies closed on Moscow and the Soviet Union faced potential annihilation, Soviet factories were frantically producing weapons to arm the millions of soldiers fighting for survival. Among these weapons was a submachine gun that would become one of the iconic firearms of World War II. A weapon so distinctive in sound that German soldiers called it the Russian accordion or burp gun. Soviet soldiers called it simply the PPSH, and they relied on it through the most brutal fighting of the war. The PPSH-41 was crude by the standards of finely machined Western firearms, but it was also reliable, effective, simple to manufacture, and produced in quantities that reflected Soviet industrial capacity at its most impressive. Over 5 million PPSH-41s were manufactured during the war, making it one of the most numerous firearms ever produced. This is the story of the submachine gun that armed the Red Army and helped turn the tide on the Eastern Front. The PPSH-41's origins lie in the Soviet Union's recognition, following the Winter War with Finland in 1939–1940, that submachine guns were valuable infantry weapons. The Finns had used the Suomi KP-31 submachine gun with devastating effectiveness against Soviet forces, demonstrating that automatic fire at close range could offset numerical inferiority. Soviet forces had submachine guns, primarily the PPD-40, but in limited numbers and with manufacturing processes too complex for rapid mass production. Georgy Shpagin, an experienced Soviet weapons designer who had worked on various firearms, including the DSHK heavy machine gun, was tasked with developing a submachine gun simpler and cheaper to manufacture than the PPD-40, while maintaining combat effectiveness. Shpagin's design philosophy emphasized simplicity, reliability, and manufacturability above all else. The result was the PPSH-41, Pistolet Pulemyot Shpagina 41, or Shpagin's machine pistol of 1941, adopted in December 1940, just months before Germany's invasion. The PPSH-41's design was brilliantly simple. The receiver was made from stamped steel, cheap, quick to produce, and requiring minimal precision machining. The barrel was chrome-lined for durability and to resist corrosion, important given the PPSH's intended use in harsh conditions. The bolt was a simple rectangular steel block that moved back and forth within the receiver using blowback operation, the simplest possible automatic firing mechanism. The return spring surrounded the bolt, keeping the design compact. The trigger mechanism was straightforward, allowing either semi-automatic or full automatic fire, selected by a lever. The most distinctive feature was the drum magazine. The PPSH-41 used a 71-round drum magazine adapted from the Suomi design, though it also accepted simpler 35-round curved box magazines. The drum magazine gave Soviet soldiers firepower advantage. 71 rounds meant sustained fire without reloading, crucial in the close-quarters urban combat that characterized much of the Eastern Front fighting. The magazine sat beneath the receiver, giving the weapon its characteristic profile. Another distinctive feature was the barrel jacket, a perforated metal shroud surrounding the barrel that compensated for the short barrel length, only about 10.6 inches, by extending forward, protecting the shooter's hand from the hot barrel and helping control muzzle rise during automatic fire. The barrel jacket with its circular holes became one of the PPSH's most recognizable features. The completed weapon was 33 inches long and weighed about 8 pounds loaded with the drum magazine. It fired the 7.62 by 25 mm Tokarev cartridge, a high-velocity pistol round that provided good penetration and flat trajectory. Rate of fire was approximately 900 rounds per minute, very high, contributing to the distinctive burp sound that gave the weapon its German nickname. Effective range was about 150 to 200 meters, though the weapon could be fired at longer ranges with decreasing accuracy. Manufacturing the PPSH-41 required minimal skilled labor and sophisticated machinery. The stamped steel receiver could be produced quickly using presses. The bolt required minimal machining. The barrel was one of the few components requiring precision work, but chrome linings simplified production. Assembly was straightforward, with the weapon containing relatively few parts compared to machined firearms. This manufacturability was critical. Soviet factories, many hastily relocated east of the Urals to escape German advances, could produce PPSH-41s even with limited tooling and partially trained workers. Production began in early 1941, and by the time Germany invaded in June 1941, thousands had been produced. But the need was far greater than initial production. As Soviet forces suffered catastrophic losses in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa, weapons production became desperate. Every available factory was mobilized. The PPSH-41's simple design meant that even factories with minimal experience in firearms could manufacture components. Production accelerated dramatically throughout 1942 and 1943, reaching over 2 million units per year at its peak. The combat debut of the PPSH-41 came during the defense of Moscow in the winter of 1941-1942. Soviet forces, desperately holding against German armies that had reached the outskirts of the capital, used PPSH-41s extensively in close-quarters combat. The weapon proved highly effective in winter conditions. Its simple design continued functioning in extreme cold that disabled more sophisticated weapons. Soviet infantry armed with PPSH-41s could deliver automatic fire that German forces, primarily armed with bolt-action rifles, couldn't match at close range. Junior Lieutenant Alexei Petrov, defending Moscow with a unit equipped with PPSH-41s, described their effectiveness. "The Germans would attack in waves. We'd let them close to perhaps 50 meters, then open fire with our PPSHs. The sound was incredible. Hundreds of submachine guns firing together sounded like a continuous roar. German soldiers would fall in rows. The psychological effect was as important as the physical casualties. German soldiers facing that wall of automatic fire would often break and retreat. The PPSH gave us confidence. Even outnumbered, we had firepower that could stop attacks." The Battle of Stalingrad in 1942-1943 became the iconic combat environment for the PPSH-41. Urban combat in the ruins of Stalingrad was fought at close range, often room to room and building to building. In this environment, the PPSH's automatic fire and large magazine capacity proved devastatingly effective. Soviet assault groups would storm German positions, firing PPSHs from the hip, clearing rooms with sustained automatic fire that no bolt-action rifle could match. Sergeant Vasily Zaitsev, the famous Soviet sniper, wrote about PPSH-equipped assault troops he worked alongside in Stalingrad. He wrote, "They would attack with incredible courage, PPSHs firing continuously. In the rubble and ruins, automatic fire was supreme. The Germans had machine guns, but a soldier with a PPSH was almost as effective and far more mobile. I saw assault groups of 5 or 6 men, all with PPSHs, clear German-held buildings that would have required dozens of men with rifles. The weapon gave individual soldiers enormous firepower." The PPSH-41's reliability under harsh conditions became legendary. It functioned in mud, dust, snow, and extreme temperatures. The loose tolerances that precision-minded Western designers might consider flaws actually contributed to reliability. Dirt and debris that would jam a tightly fitted weapon didn't affect the PPSH significantly. Soldiers learned that the weapon required minimal maintenance. Clearing the barrel occasionally and keeping the mechanism roughly clean was sufficient to keep it operational. The high rate of fire, while providing impressive firepower, also meant rapid ammunition consumption. A soldier firing full automatic could empty the 71-round drum magazine in about 5 seconds. This made fire discipline critical. Spraying bullets wildly would leave the soldier defenseless when the magazine emptied. Experienced soldiers learned to fire in short bursts, conserving ammunition while maintaining suppressive fire. The drum magazine, while providing excellent capacity, had some drawbacks. It was heavier than box magazines, making the loaded weapon front-heavy. Loading the drum was time-consuming and required a loading tool. The drum mechanism was more complex than box magazine springs, meaning drums could malfunction if damaged or if the spring weakened. Soviet forces supplemented drums with simpler 35-round.
German soldiers captured PPSH-41s in large numbers, and many chose to use them instead of their issued weapons. The German MP-40 submachine gun, while well-designed, was produced in far smaller numbers than German forces needed, and many German soldiers had only bolt-action rifles. A captured PPSH provided automatic fire and large magazine capacity, significant advantages in close combat. The Germans even produced new magazines allowing PPSH-41s to use German 9mm ammunition, and some damaged PPSH-41s were rebuilt to German specifications. Feldwebel Gottfried Becker, who fought on the Eastern Front and carried a captured PPSH, described his reasoning. "I found a PPSH after a battle and kept it instead of my Kar 98K rifle. The automatic fire was invaluable in close combat, which was frequent on the Eastern Front. The weapon's crude construction actually made it reliable. It kept working when more refined weapons failed. I carried it through the rest of the war, scavenging ammunition from captured Soviet supplies or dead Soviet soldiers. Many German soldiers did the same. Soviet weapons were often better suited to Eastern Front conditions than our own." The PPSH-41 served in various specialized roles beyond standard infantry use. Tank crews carried them for self-defense. The compact design and automatic fire made them ideal for the close-quarters combat that tank crews might face if forced to abandon their vehicles. Soviet naval infantry used PPSHs extensively, valuing the firepower for amphibious assaults and coastal operations. Partisan forces operating behind German lines relied heavily on captured or airdropped PPSHs, as the weapon's simplicity made it easy to maintain with minimal resources. The psychological impact of massed PPSH fire was significant. The distinctive sound of hundreds of PPSHs firing simultaneously, a continuous roaring buzz, was terrifying to troops facing it. The sheer volume of fire created the impression of overwhelming force even when Soviet units weren't necessarily numerically superior. German after-action reports frequently mentioned the demoralizing effect of Soviet automatic fire, specifically noting the PPSH's contribution. Production efficiency continued improving throughout the war. Soviet factories refined manufacturing processes, reducing production time and cost per unit, while maintaining quality. By 1943, a PPSH-41 required approximately 5 to 6 man-hours to manufacture, far less than Western submachine guns like the Thompson, which required approximately 20 man-hours. This manufacturing efficiency allowed the Soviet Union to produce PPSH-41s in enormous quantities without bankrupting the military budget. The weapon's simplicity also meant minimal training was required. Soldiers could be taught basic operation and maintenance in hours rather than days, which was important when the Red Army was constantly absorbing new conscripts to replace combat losses. The tactical employment of the PPSH-41 evolved as the war progressed. Early in the war, PPSHs were distributed somewhat randomly, with some units having many while others had few. By 1943, Soviet doctrine increasingly called for concentrating submachine guns in specialized assault units. These shock troops, armed entirely or predominantly with PPSHs, would lead attacks using their concentrated automatic fire to suppress enemy positions and break through defensive lines. Regular rifle units would then exploit the breakthroughs created by these assault groups. Senior Sergeant Ivan Konev, who fought on the Eastern Front and carried a captured PPSH, described their tactics. "We were the tip of the spear. Before an attack, we'd move forward, staying low. When we reached perhaps 30 or 40 meters from German positions, we'd all rise and charge, firing our PPSHs continuously. The German defenders would be suppressed by our fire. They couldn't raise their heads to shoot back effectively. We'd be in their trenches before they could organize resistance. Once we'd secured the position, regular infantry with rifles would move up to consolidate. Our concentrated automatic fire made us far more effective than our numbers suggested." The variety of combat environments on the Eastern Front tested the PPSH-41's versatility. In the forests and swamps of Belarus, where visibility was limited and combat was at close range, the PPSH was ideal. In the open steppes of Ukraine, where ranges were longer, the PPSH's limited effective range was less advantageous, though it remained valuable for close defense and assaulting fortified positions. In the urban rubble of destroyed cities, Stalingrad, Leningrad, Berlin, the PPSH excelled, with its automatic fire dominating the close-quarters environment. Winter combat presented unique challenges and advantages. The PPSH's simple mechanism continued functioning at temperatures that disabled more complex weapons. However, the metal construction meant the weapon became painfully cold to touch. Soldiers learned to wear gloves or wrap portions of the weapon with cloth. The chrome-lined barrel resisted the moisture that caused rust in other weapons. Soviet soldiers fighting in winter conditions learned to trust their PPSHs when other weapons failed. The liberation of Soviet territory and the subsequent advance into Eastern Europe and Germany saw PPSH-41s in every Red Army unit. By 1944, Soviet infantry divisions typically had thousands of submachine guns, giving Soviet forces firepower superiority in close combat that German forces, increasingly short of automatic weapons, couldn't match. The Red Army's ability to produce and distribute automatic weapons in enormous quantities reflected Soviet industrial recovery and growing material superiority. The Battle of Berlin in April-May 1945 saw perhaps the most extensive use of PPSH-41s in urban combat. Soviet assault troops fighting through the ruins of the German capital against fanatical resistance relied heavily on their PPSHs. The automatic fire was perfect for clearing buildings, suppressing defenders, and advancing through rubble. The final assault on the Reichstag, the symbolic conclusion of the European War, was conducted by Soviet troops armed primarily with PPSH-41s. Senior Lieutenant Stepan Neustreov, whose unit raised the Soviet flag over the Reichstag, described the final assault. "We fought room by room, floor by floor. German defenders, SS troops, Hitler Youth, desperate men, fought savagely. We used our PPSHs constantly, firing short bursts to clear rooms, longer bursts to suppress positions. The sound echoed through the building's ruins, constant gunfire, grenades exploding, men shouting. Without automatic weapons, we couldn't have cleared the building. The PPSH gave us the firepower to overcome defenders who had every advantage of position." Post-war, the PPSH-41 continued service with the Soviet military and was widely exported to communist nations and Soviet-aligned forces. Chinese Communist forces received or copied PPSHs during the Chinese Civil War and Korean War. North Korean and Chinese forces used PPSHs extensively in Korea, where American forces encountered them and recognized their effectiveness. Viet Minh forces used PPSHs against the French in Indochina. Various insurgent and revolutionary groups received PPSHs from Soviet sources throughout the Cold War. The longevity of PPSH-41's service testified to its effectiveness. The weapon remained in Soviet service into the 1950s before being replaced by more modern designs. Many Warsaw Pact nations used PPSHs into the 1960s. In various irregular forces and conflicts, PPSH-41s continued appearing into the 21st century, a testament to the durability and simplicity of Spagen's design. Comparison with other nation submachine guns reveals the PPSH's unique characteristics. The German MP-40, while more refined, was produced in far smaller numbers, about 1 million, compared to over 5 million PPSH's 41s. The American Thompson was effective but expensive and complex. The British Sten was simpler and cheaper than the PPSH, but less reliable and poorly ergonomic. The PPSH represented an optimal balance between simplicity, reliability, effectiveness, and manufacturability that no other World War II submachine gun quite achieved.
Technical assessment of the PPSH-41 reveals both strengths and limitations. Strengths included the simple, reliable mechanism that functioned under adverse conditions, the high rate of fire providing impressive suppressive capability, the large-capacity drum magazine allowing sustained fire, the chrome-lined barrel providing durability, and the minimal manufacturing requirements allowing mass production. Limitations included the high ammunition consumption requiring extensive supply logistics, the limited effective range restricting the weapon to close combat, the heavy front-heavy weight when loaded with drum magazine, and the poor ergonomics by modern standards with minimal stock design and crude sights. The cultural impact of the PPSH-41 in Soviet and Russian memory is significant. The weapon became iconic of Soviet World War II service, appearing in countless Soviet war films, monuments, and historical recreations. Veterans who carried PPSHs spoke of them with respect and affection, noting how the weapon gave them confidence against better-equipped German forces. The PPSH became a symbol of Soviet industrial achievement, the ability to produce weapons in quantities that overwhelmed better-equipped enemies through sheer material superiority. The manufacturing legacy of the PPSH-41 influenced subsequent Soviet firearms design. The emphasis on simplicity, stamped metal construction, loose tolerances for reliability, and ease of manufacture became hallmarks of Soviet weapons design philosophy. The AK-47, which appeared after the war and became perhaps history's most successful military rifle, directly inherited design principles pioneered in the PPSH-41. The Soviet approach to weapons design, prioritizing reliability, simplicity, and manufacturability over refinement, proved highly successful and was copied by other nations. Personal accounts from PPSH-41 users reveal the human dimension of the weapon's service. Soldiers developed personal relationships with their PPSHs, naming them, decorating them with personal touches, and trusting them with their lives. The weapon's reliability built confidence. Soldiers knew their PPSHs would work when needed, regardless of conditions. This psychological factor, while difficult to quantify, contributed significantly to the weapon's effectiveness. Guard Sergeant Anatoly Shapiro, who carried a PPSH from Stalingrad to Berlin, wrote in his memoirs, "My PPSH was with me through the worst fighting of the war. I cleaned it when I could, but often went weeks without proper maintenance. It never failed me. In Stalingrad, in the forests of Belorussia, in the ruins of Berlin, that weapon kept me alive. I knew that when I pulled the trigger, it would fire. That certainty was priceless in combat. The PPSH wasn't beautiful or refined, but it was reliable, effective, and always there when I needed it." The German perspective on facing massed PPSH fire provides another dimension to understanding the weapon's impact. German soldiers' accounts frequently mention the psychological effect of Soviet automatic fire. The sound of hundreds of PPSHs opening fire simultaneously was described as overwhelming, creating a wall of fire that was difficult to counter with bolt-action rifles. German units learned to fear Soviet assault troops armed with submachine guns. Recognizing that once Soviet forces close to submachine gun range, German firepower advantages from longer-range rifles disappeared. Obergefreiter Franz Weber, who fought on the Eastern Front from 1942 to 1944, described the experience. The worst moment was hearing the PPSH's open fire. That distinctive sound, like ripping cloth but amplified 1,000 times, meant Soviet assault troops were charging. You'd see them coming through smoke and dust, PPSHs firing from the hip, and you knew your rifle's range and accuracy advantages meant nothing anymore. In close combat, their automatic fire was overwhelming. We tried to stop them at long range, but if they reached close quarters, we were at severe disadvantage. The maintenance and repair of PPSH-41s in field conditions demonstrated the weapon's robust design. Damaged PPSHs could often be repaired with basic tools and improvised parts. The simple mechanism meant that even poorly trained armorers could diagnose and fix common problems. Field-expedient repairs, using parts cannibalized from other damaged weapons, kept PPSHs operational even when supply lines were disrupted. This maintainability was crucial on the Eastern Front, where Soviet logistics were often strained and proper repair facilities were unavailable. The PPSH-41's sound signature, the burp that gave it its German nickname, resulted from the very high rate of fire. At 900 rounds per minute, the weapon fired 15 rounds per second, faster than most other submachine guns. This created a distinctive audio profile that veterans from both sides instantly recognized decades later. The sound became psychologically associated with Soviet military power, triggering immediate recognition and response even years after the war ended. Ammunition logistics for the PPSH-41 were substantial but manageable. The 7.62 by 25 mm Tokarev cartridge was also used in the TT-33 pistol, providing some logistical commonality. Soviet factories produced billions of rounds during the war, ensuring adequate supply despite the PPSH's prodigious consumption. Soldiers typically carried several loaded magazines. Drum magazines were heavy, so most carried 1 or 2 drums plus several box magazines for a total load of 200 to 300 rounds, weighing 15 to 20 pounds. The training program for PPSH-41 users was necessarily abbreviated given the circumstances of the war. New soldiers received basic instruction on loading, firing, clearing malfunctions, and field maintenance. More detailed training was often impossible given time constraints and the constant need for replacements at the front. The PPSH's simplicity meant that even minimally trained soldiers could operate it effectively, though experienced users developed techniques for maximizing accuracy and conserving ammunition that only came with practice. Foreign users' assessment of captured PPSH-41s varied. German soldiers who used captured PPSHs generally praised the weapon's reliability and firepower while noting its crude construction and poor ergonomics. Finnish forces captured PPSHs and pressed them into service, finding them effective though inferior to their own Suomi submachine guns in refinement. American soldiers who encountered PPSHs in Korea recognized their effectiveness, particularly the large-capacity drum magazine, although they generally preferred their own weapons. The influence of the PPSH-41 on post-war submachine gun design was significant. The emphasis on simplicity, stamped metal construction, loose tolerances for reliability, and ease of manufacture became hallmarks of Soviet weapons design philosophy. The AK-47, which appeared after the war and became perhaps history's most successful military rifle, directly inherited design principles pioneered in the PPSH-41. The Soviet approach to weapons design, prioritizing reliability, simplicity, and manufacturability over refinement, proved highly successful and was copied by other nations. Collection and preservation of the PPSH-41s has created a significant market for these historical weapons. Original World War II PPSHs are sought by collectors and museums. The weapon's historical significance, combined with their distinctive appearance and legendary status, make them valuable. However, the millions produced mean that PPSHs are more available than rarer weapons, keeping prices relatively moderate compared to some other collectible firearms. From Georgy Shpagin's design studio to the factory floors where millions were produced, from the frozen streets of Moscow in 1941 to the ruins of Berlin in 1945, from the hands of Soviet soldiers who relied on them to the memories of German soldiers who faced them, the PPSH-41 submachine gun earned its place in history through simple effectiveness. It wasn't refined, wasn't beautiful, wasn't sophisticated, but it was reliable, powerful, and available in quantities that reflected Soviet industrial might at its most impressive. The burp gun that German soldiers learned to fear, the weapon that Soviet soldiers trusted with their lives, the submachine gun produced in greater numbers than any other in history except its Soviet successor, the AK-47, proved that sometimes the crudest weapons are the most effective. The PPSH-41 embodied Soviet design philosophy: function over form, reliability over refinement, quantity over quality. That philosophy, while often derided by Western designers who prized precision and sophistication, won battles and ultimately helped win the war. The legacy of the PPSH-41 extends beyond its military service. It demonstrated that nations facing existential threats could mobilize industrial capacity to produce weapons in quantities that overwhelmed better-equipped enemies. It showed that simple, reliable designs often perform better in combat conditions than sophisticated, complex ones. And it proved that weapons need not be beautiful or refined to be effective. They need only work when called upon, regardless of conditions. The Soviet burp gun met